Just a note, this episode will talk about some of the terrible treatment of children from Native American tribes over history. If you're not up for that today, or you have younger listeners, you may want to choose another episode. Most of us have heard stories of the terrible way America has treated Native American tribes over the course of our history. If we acknowledge this is true, we should also understand how adoption was weaponized against this community. Trace Lara Hentz discovered that she was a Native American adoptee. Over the course of writing her own memoir and other articles on the subject, she began to see the need to find out how many Native American adoptees are truly out there. Find out more about Trace, her project, and the interaction between the Native American community and adoption, this time on Adoption Uncovered. Welcome, and if you could just introduce yourself and tell me how you are connected with adoption.
Yes, my name is Trace Lara Hentz, and I'm an adoptee. I was given up for adoption back in 1956, and I did go through an orphanage and a placement, I think, where the Catholic Charities place babies, and then eventually I was fostered by my adoptive parents. And so this all happened. I was born in Minnesota, in St. Paul, and then I was transported up to Superior, Wisconsin, and that's where everything pretty much took place. So I was always wondering about why I was adopted, and the particulars about why did my mother give me up. I think a lot of adoptees think that. And so I went to a judge when I was 21, and he actually let me read my adoption file, but because I was such a young person, I never read a file like that before, and I was unprepared. I didn't realize that he would let me see it, but I couldn't take copies of anything, and I couldn't have copied it anyway. But he had to hand me a little notepad and a pencil, and I took a couple pages of notes, and I think after I read my name, I started to cry. And my birth mother had given me a name. It was Laura Jean Thrall. And I don't really remember too much about the adoption file, other than it had a lot of legal documents in it. And this judge, I had originally asked him when I first met him, I said, I'm actually really curious about my medical history, if you could help me with that. And he looked at me and he said, there isn't going to be medical history in your file. And he said, and that's not right. And I thought, wow, and a judge is getting this, and this was, oh boy, let's see, it was like 1978. And this is before the internet. So he did let me read the file. Of course, I cried, and he wasn't in the courtroom, thank God, because I was there alone. I couldn't process it because I didn't know enough about what I was reading. I wrote about all of this in the memoir. The first edition came out in 2010, but then I had to add a little bit to it. So 2012 is the issue that you would find on Amazon, and that's the one that is pretty clear.
Many Native American adoptees don't know much about their past or their connection to their tribes. As a country, we don't even know how many Native American adoptees are there. This year, Trace has begun an ambitious project to change that. What drove you to start the blog and start seeking out other adoptee stories and your project?
Thank you. My initial reaction to doing a memoir was, oh God, no. But what I had done, I left the Pequot Times in Connecticut. I was working as an editor of a travel newspaper. And I came up here to Massachusetts, and I was going to be getting married. And I decided to write a book called The Only Good Indian is a Dead Indian. And I know that sounds terrible, right? It's terrible.
But it attracts attention.
I know. Well, what I did was I started to study adoption like a journalist. I just started reading everything and going onto websites. And, there wasn't too much in 2004, 2005. But I pretty much drafted this book about adoption and about Native adoptees and what I was able to find about what they call the Indian adoption projects. So, and it was so vague what was available online. I was like, there's got to be more. So, an editor in New York City called Steve Elm, he had a newsletter called Talking Stick that came out of New York, and it had a very big readership. And he told me, he said, I want you to write a story about Native adoptees. And I was like, oh boy, I got to find other adoptees first, because how do you tell that story? It wasn't just me, even though felt I was very isolated, but obviously there were going to be a lot other adoptees out there. So one by one, meeting them, talking to them, I kept sending Steve drafts and he'd go, nope. And then I'd send another draft and he'd go, nope. And I mean, literally, Sherilyn, I woke up one morning and it came out. I just wrote it really fast. And I had been to a ceremony called Wiping the Tears, and I had met other adoptees there. And I don't know what it was. It was like, poof, it came out and I sent it to him and he goes, yep. And that was it. He published it. And it was called Generation After Generation, We Are Coming Home. And then because of that, I got contacted by a lot of other adoptees. So that Dead Indians draft was about adoption. I sent it to an agent and she goes, you got to write about you. And I was like, oh man, I don't really want to write about me. I didn't want to, but she insisted. So that's why it took 5 years to do this One Small Sacrifice, a memoir, because then I knew I had to do it all. I had to actually write about my childhood, and I had to write about opening my adoption, all of that stuff. So because I did that, I kept meeting more and more and more and more adoptees. So that led me to write, or to help to collect stories for the first book anthology called Two Worlds, Lost Children of the Indian Adoption Projects. And because of that led to another, and it led to another. And then we did a poetry anthology. I was working with a woman out west. She lived in Seattle. We just did poetry for the fourth book. And it's really good. It's fantastic poetry. I don't know many people if they like poetry, but it's called In the Veins. It's a book about the same topic. But what happened, because I did that first draft, just in the last, oh boy, I don't even want to say 6 months, all of a sudden, here comes this new book called Almost Dead Indians. And it's almost because there are a lot of adoptees that say we were dead to our family. We were dead to our tribes. We weren't available. We couldn't even get access to our records to make that connection. So this book ties in with some research I had done in 2000 called First Contact, which is about Native American history and slavery. And then I had all of the research I had done on adoption, which was that Dead Indians first draft. And so this one just poof, it did it too. I was so surprised. It's a lot of history. In the very beginning of the book, I actually start with a quiz asking people if they could even guess how many Native American or Indigenous First Nations people were in North America, because actually that's unknown. That's unknown. I mean, how is that possible? But what the book goes into is all the various different ways we became dead Indians, which residential school had a lot to do with that, because it erased children's language, their memories of their culture. They did get out of residential school, but generally they were very assimilated, what they call colonized. And then we have the whole group of people from North America who are First Nations. They belong to tribes, but because they were placed in closed adoptions, boom, they're gone. And if they can't open a record, they're never going to know. So I was so stunned. Just yesterday, I posted a video on the American Indian Adoptees website that there's a woman in Canada who's advocating for 60 scoop adoptees. That's what their Indian adoption project was called, 60 scoop. A lot of people have heard that. They know 60 scoop adoptees. Well, anyway, they don't have the data in Canada, and we obviously do not have the data in the United States. And as I told you, when I first started looking in 2004, could I find documentation? Like, could I find statistics or records or reports? Or none of that was available online. So I decided, really, in I think last November, I started thinking about maybe I need to just tell them, the adoptees that are out there that maybe don't even know all the information, that I'm going to do a count, the count 2024. And it's real simple. They can fill out all the information that they have. It can be very scarce. They may not know a lot, but they could have their birth name, which would be very helpful. And we need the data. Essentially, that's what the Count 2024 is about. We need to know the United States adoptees. Some of them were sent to Canada, and some of the Canadian adoptees were sent to the United States. But like the story I published today on the AmericanIndianAdoptees.com, there was a young woman from Canada that was taken to Scotland. I mean, literally, these adoptees are everywhere. I had a friend who found an adoptee in Iceland. So that's why this count means so much to me, because I think if we can get the word out, people, it's a simple form. It's like 2 pages. Fill out what you know and mail it to me. And then what we'll do is we'll start to compile our own statistics. But it takes quite a bit to get people to fill out a survey. So I hope it works. I'm praying it works. My fingers are crossed. My toes are crossed.
So you're looking for people who they know they've been adopted. They think
Yes,
they might have some sort of tribal background, but
exactly.
okay.
And they
Hmm.
might actually know, like there's a few adoptees in Two Worlds that were
Hmm.
told by their adoptive parents, you're a member of the Yakima tribe in Washington and you need to enroll with them because you maybe will get a college scholarship or something like that. There were several adoptees that knew, like an Apache friend who was raised in New York City, and he knew he was Apache. So there's a chance that they might have a little glimmer, but it doesn't mean that they're actually going to be able to open their records, because I think there's only 15 states at the moment that you can actually, like myself, Minnesota's been closed until July of this year. And I've never seen, maybe I did see it in that legal file, but I want a copy of my original birth certificate because there'll be a lot more information on them. So that's July of 2024. This adoptee will be filing the fee or whatever it is and the form to get a copy of my original birth certificate. So that's in the plan. Well, the count would include anybody that was adopted in North America that may know. They may know. They may not have all of the information, but they have a pretty good, clear idea that they're Native. And it's sometimes the way you look, but it's sometimes the way you feel. So I don't want to, what's the word, discriminate against anybody. But there should be some proof, if you have it, to what tribe it could have been. And there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. But there are probably 400 plus that are wanting federal recognition. I know that's kind of out of the picture. It's huge how many tribes were here and how many tribes exist federally, and then how many tribes are struggling to be federally recognized, but because of paper and history and documentation and all of that, East Coast tribes in particular have a very hard time proving continuity of their tribal nation and their governments and who was running things and all of that. So, but in Canada, I honestly can't tell you how many nations are there. I wish I knew. And I'll have to look that up. But we've got, they said in Canada that the class action that happened in Canada, there were 20,000 approximately. But adoptees are saying, whoa, wait a minute, there's way, way, way more than that. And they could be anywhere. They could be in Australia, they could be in Holland, they could be in Spain, they could be anywhere. So 20,000 was what Canada came up with. And what we have in the back of the book, I have the outcomes of the Indian Adoption Project's estimates, which was about 13,000, maybe just a little under that. So would I take 13,000 adoptees? Absolutely. Would I take all of them? Absolutely. Would I want to hear their stories? Absolutely. I've already met hundreds of adoptees. Could I meet more? Absolutely. So the count is about helping them bridge that there is a large group of us. It's not just me. I mean, there's plenty of adoptees I know that are helping me do this, and they're for it completely. And what Canada did was they asked the Crown, which they're a Commonwealth, so they had to ask the Crown, and they settled with adoptees called 60 Scoop Adoptees. And now there's a few more coming up. So they're not even done with their process. So what am I trying to do in the United States? If we had 10,000, let's say, and they were documented, could I find a law firm that would want to do a class action? Yes, absolutely. So the count would matter in that regard, that we have documented. If we got 10,000, that would be pretty fantastic, I think. If we could count 50,000, that would even be better. And then we can actually, because we have these surveys that are filled out, has their name, are they enrolled, do they know what their first names were, were they given a name before the adoptions, all the documentation that they could possibly have, they can fill it out on this survey.
As we look at the history of the awful things our country has done to the Native American population, we find that adoption was used for the purpose of erasing Native culture rather than making sure children were in healthy homes.
How did this happen, that children were taken from these tribes and then ended up somewhere far away from that tribe? Like, can you give me some examples of like what was that process and who instigated that?
Well, it's pretty gruesome because when you talk about a country that's colonized, or a territory, or like North America, if you're looking at a map, you can see how big that is. When the people that got here planted their flag, let's call them that. I call them the plant the flag people. Even in the book, they ran into resistance because there were tribes here, obviously, and the history becomes genocide for a while, and then that's really horrific, and it is documented, and I have some of that in the new book, Almost Dead Indians. But what happened when some of the people that were planning things for the country of the United States, they met in upstate New York at a place called Lake Mohonk. And Captain Pratt, General Pratt, I think he eventually became known, he had run a prison for Native prisoners, and he decided that a residential school would be a really good idea. So the Lake Mohonk people got behind that and said, okay, well, we've got a military barracks in Pennsylvania, and we are going to take tribal children and put them in this residential. They could not leave. I mean, they were literally there. Once you're at these barracks, you're in, and that was it. There's quite a bit in my story, the second chapter in the new book called Disappeared. That explains how the Lake Mohonk group decided that they hadn't annihilated all the Indians and that they were going to take their children. Well, before and during and after adoption was going on, and it was actually about ethnic cleansing. It was about erasing. If you were young enough, you may not remember who your family was, and there are children 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old that had a vague memory of who their parents were, and that they belonged to a tribe, but it was community that they were taken out of. And if you remove the children from a community, a village, a tribal village, you destroy their future. And apparently these Lake Mohonk guys figured that out, and that's the reason why they were either assimilating through the residential boarding schools or they were removing children due to adoption. So it's not like American adoption in the sense that, there are children that are orphaned or they have to be placed with other families. It's not like that. This was so purposeful that they wanted to remove an entire population of Native children if they could get away with it. And in the United States, there was a fellow named Arnold Lyso. I hope I'm saying that right. Lyslo. And he conducted propaganda and advertising, and they created catalogs of Native children. And he had a woman in Good Housekeeping magazine. She wrote an article, and they got 800 responses from people willing to adopt Native children. And they had created catalogs in the US and in Canada, what these children looked like. They were little kids mostly. And so some of the adoptees that I met said that they knew that they were chosen out of a catalog. And that's just bizarre. I mean, what are you shopping for, like shoes? And then you say, well, maybe I'll do a child too. Why not? It was so coordinated. Let's put it this way. So we've got the Indian Adoption Projects, which is one project they wanted to move us into an American family so that we would become American and we would forget we were tribal members. The other part of it was ARENA, the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America. And what that is that's where they move them across the borders. That's where Manitoba adoptees, I write about them, a few of them in the book, they move them to the United States. They could be anywhere. They could be in Louisiana, they could be in Indiana, they could be in California, or they could be in Europe, which there are several of them that got moved to Holland or to England or wherever. So we have these major programs that had been set up to accomplish this. And when I found that out, of course, when in 2004, when I looked at adoption, I didn't know any of this. And that's the reason why I've not given up on it. The more adoptees I meet and the more stories, there's way more news coming out of Canada about adoptees that have come forward and that have actually gone into reunion with their siblings, because a lot of times their parents have already passed. And are they getting re-enrolled? Yes. And are they meeting family? Yes. And I think that's the whole point of this, is that if I can find adoptees I can help by getting their records open, that would be super good. And if I can count adoptees, then that would also be a way to get past all these frozen government files that no one seems to have access to.
There are still Native American children in need of safe homes. Based on our history, we need to take extra steps to make sure these children and their birth culture are nurtured.
It seems like even currently among Native tribes on reservations, there is a lot of poverty. There's still children that are,
yes,
the first moms are not, maybe not able to support them or whatever.
Yes.
Like what would be the respectful, the right way to go about that?
All right. Well, there are some modern solutions. One was started in Austria called the SOS Village. And what that means is that orphans, brothers, sisters are kept together and they're taken to an SOS village, which is kind of a tribal sounding thing. And the homes there's maybe 10 houses, and the mother in the SOS mother would actually raise these children with other children, but they would all be in one big house, 10 of them or more. And that's a great solution. And I think tribes are now looking at that. There's at least 3 that I know of that have created villages for people whose parents are not in good condition. Would I say that some are going to be adopted? Yes. But what they have in tribes is called kinship adoption, where an auntie is your mother anyway. Your grandmother can, obviously, if she's able, So tribes never had adoption. I don't mean, not in the way that you and I know it, where it's, like paperwork and lawyers and judges. No, they would take children into other, like an auntie would raise her sister's children if that mom was out of it, if she couldn't function or cope. Now, here's the thing to know about the United States. 80% of Native people are living off the res right now. So we've got an issue with, if a young couple has, or maybe just a single woman has a baby, And if she's not in a good position, the social worker could come in and take that child. But there is a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, a federal law. So what if that mother says, "Hey, you can't take my child. I'm a member of the Cherokee tribe." Well, the Cherokee tribe is supposed to be notified by the court system, and if that child has to absolutely be removed, which in some cases it's an absolute must. What they do is they look for a relative first. They look for another family in the same reservation or even an urban Indian family. They will also take families outside of the culture, but under the condition that they promise that they will bring them to see relatives. And there's a wonderful program in Canada called Friendship Centers. So when non-Native families decide to adopt a Native child, they can bring them on weekends, and what they have is singing and dancing and culture and language. And your new parents, your adoptive parents, become part of that. They participate 100%. So there are solutions for children who are in need. And I absolutely know that there are children who need families. There's no question. It's always been that way, and it's always going to be that way. So looking at it creatively, I think that right across the border from Buffalo, there's a whole group there that's running friendship centers. So if a non-Native couple has a Native child, they bring them to the friendship center. They get to meet other Native kids. They get to see other Native people, and they're constantly in contact with them. That way, the adoptive parents don't feel like they're not part of it, because they are part of it. If you're raising a child, you're part of it. So I love that solution, and I love the SOS Village. And will there be adoptions? Yes. So we're in kind of a mess because the history is not widely known. The people that want to adopt Native children don't realize that there is a big cultural window there that they have to open, and that they have to let that child know who they are. So I have always kind of advocated for legal guardianship, where your paperwork isn't fake, where you don't have a fake birth certificate, and that you can have contact. Because if you're trying to raise a healthy child, they need all of those things. They need the truth. They need their parents. They need love. They need consistency, and hopefully that's where we're headed. Because I think these stranger adoptions aren't really good for the child. Myself, that's how I felt anyway. Sure, there are lots of people who had fantastic adoptive parents. There's no question, and they actually helped. There's a really good story in this book by Joey, who had an adoptive mother in New York that decided to help him go back to his tribal nation in Canada. Just read that story. It tells you everything you need to know. This woman is so incredible, this adoptive mom. I just want to hug her. Now she's passed. And when Joey wrote this, you could tell he paused in a few places. He goes, "Let me catch my breath here. I might have to cry a little bit." I mean, he loved her so much. She was a light in his life. And he did feel bad. I mean, he wanted to go back to Canada, and he did, and he met his tribes, and met both of his parents. But it doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be negative. Adoptive parents, if they join in with this, knowing as much as they possibly can about the child they adopt, then I think things will work out better for everybody.
Even if we are not Native American ourselves, there are things we can do to come alongside them and help them in their fight to regain their culture and their children.
Do you have anything specifically that those of us that we're not Native, we're on the outside, what can we do to support people like you and adoptees and Native communities so
Right.
that this can be made right? Like, what support do you need from us?
Well, that's a perfect question, because we call you an ally then. And if you actually self-educate, because you're not going to find it in a school, you can actually go ahead and get the book Two Worlds, and then you're going to know. You're going to know what adoptees went through to find their way back. And the adoptees in there did find their way back. So that's the reason why that book was done. So that when you're an ally, I have a friend in Vermont that asked that very same question. It's good for you to question American history. It's really powerful when you start to do that, Because when you write off a population that died due to disease, they didn't die due to disease. I mean, that's really easy thing to say. Oh, they had contact with people from the outside world. No, they always had contact with people from the outside world. Tribes, see, there's a whole different history here. So some of the earliest visitors to North America, there were some Tibetan monks, believe it or not. There were people from I want to say like the Viking regions, like the people that were sailing ships way even before Columbus. So that's in the beginning of the book. So if you want to be an ally, just read up a little bit. I mean, that just means that's how you don't have to support me. You can read websites, you can read blogs, but just know a little bit more about North American history. I think that would be a very powerful place for everyone to start, because we could start to erase some of these racial divisions that shouldn't even exist. And it exists because there's such an ignorance about Native people. Everybody thinks, oh, they're drunks, or there's a lot of poverty, and there is alcoholism to an extent, but alcohol is a medication. So if you look at it like that if you can self-medicate out of trauma, you'll try, because it's probably cheap. You can get alcohol pretty easily. It's them trying to solve their trauma. And that isn't good that they chose that road, because it can kill you. Obviously, we know that alcohol can kill you. So, but look beyond the poverty. And if you can make some Native friends, if you could go to, it just out of curiosity, if you look around your state to find out what tribes are there, and then you can actually go visit them, go to their museum, make a friend if you can. That would be the most powerful way to be an ally. And there is a movement right now called Land Back, where some of the federal lands are being reassigned to the tribes because it was their land and then it was confiscated. So if you can say, oh yeah, I know what land back is, it means that I'm standing on Pocumtuck land here in Massachusetts. I know where I live, whose land this was. And there are how many tribes in the state? Well, in mine, it's like 3. There should be more. There's several more here, but they're not recognized, right? So if you can learn about your state, that would be a really good thing to do. And I think you just doing this recording will help people understand that there's a bigger history to America and North America that we weren't made aware of. And I think I know why, because they don't want to be held responsible for what they did. The residential schools, there's settlements now in Canada for them. In the United States, no. So United States has got a long way to go.
If you are a Native American adoptee or know someone who is, Trace would love for you to be a part of the Count 2024. For more information on Trace, her writing, and her projects, please check out my website at adoptionuncovered.com. And thank you.